Montana Territory. Autumn, 1886. Nobody noticed what was happening beneath that barn. From the dirt road cutting through the valley, it looked like any other homestead structure. Weathered timber, a peaked roof patched with tar paper, the kind of building you'd pass without a second glance. But inside, beneath those floorboards, where 2 horses and a milk cow shifted their weight, something unusual was taking shape. A woman was digging. Not a root cellar, not a storm shelter, a bedroom. And when the worst blizzard in Montana's recorded history buried the territory under snow and ice, that strange decision, the one her neighbors had quietly mocked, became the reason she and her children survived while others barely made it through. If you want to see one practical survival lesson every week that actually worked when lives depended on it, hit that subscribe button right now. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and let's dive into a piece of frontier engineering that changed how people thought about shelter. Eleanor Pritchard wasn't trying to prove anything. She was a 32-year-old widow with 2 children, a boy of 9 and a girl of 6, working a homestead claim 3 miles outside what would eventually become the town of Lewistown. Her husband had died 18 months earlier from pneumonia, the same winter illness that seemed to hunt through every drafty cabin in the territory when temperatures dropped. That previous winter had nearly taken her daughter too. The cabin she lived in was standard for the region. Rough-hewn log walls chinked with mud and moss, a single-room layout with a sleeping loft, and a stone fireplace that ate wood faster than Eleanor could split it. The floor was pine planks laid directly on packed earth, and on cold mornings, frost would creep up through the gaps, spreading across the boards like white fingers. She'd wake before dawn to find ice crusted on the inside of the window glass. The children would huddle under every quilt and blanket she owned, their breath visible in the morning air even with the fire burning through the night. Wind was the worst part. The Montana wind didn't just blow, it searched. It found every crack, every seam, every imperfect joint in the cabin walls and poured through like water. Eleanor would stuff rags into the gaps, pack moss between the logs, hang blankets against the walls, but the cold still came. It came through the floor. It came through the chinking. It came down the chimney when the wind direction shifted. By February of that first winter alone, her daughter had developed a wet cough that wouldn't clear. The child spent 3 weeks wrapped in blankets by the fire, skin pale, fever spiking at night. Eleanor burned through half her winter with supply, keeping that one room warm enough to fight the sickness. The girl survived. Barely. And Eleanor decided something had to change. She started paying attention to the barn. The barn was smaller than the cabin, just 20 feet by 16 feet, but stayed noticeably warmer. She noticed it the previous winter when checking on the livestock. The 2 horses and the milk cow generated body heat, and their breath added moisture and warmth to the enclosed space. Hay stacked in the loft acted as insulation. The barn's foundation was partially bermed with earth on the north side, a practical detail that blocked the prevailing wind. Inside the barn on a night when the cabin was freezing, Eleanor could work without gloves. She stood there one evening in late September, listening to the horses shift in their stalls, feeling the relative warmth, and thought, what if I could sleep here? Not in the barn itself. That wouldn't be proper, and the smell would be unbearable in an enclosed space. But beneath it, underground, using the barn as a roof, the livestock as a furnace, and the earth itself as insulation. It wasn't a brilliant idea. It was a desperate one. But desperation makes you practical. Eleanor began digging in early October, working in the mornings after feeding the animals. She chose a spot in the center of the barn, directly beneath where the hay was stacked, away from the stalls where manure would accumulate. The excavation was backbreaking work, 8 feet wide, 12 feet long, 7 feet deep. She hauled the dirt out in buckets, spreading it in low spots around the property. 3 weeks of digging. No help. No announcement to her neighbors. Just quiet, methodical work. The chamber took shape slowly, carefully. Eleanor had no formal training in building, but she'd watched her husband work, and she understood the basics. Keep water out, keep walls stable, keep air moving. The excavation itself was only the beginning. For the walls, she used what was available. Field stone from the creek bed, flat pieces of sandstone and limestone that she could stack without mortar. She dry stacked them carefully, fitting the stones together like a puzzle, leaning them slightly inward so gravity would hold them in place. Behind the stone, she packed earth tight, creating a barrier between the chamber and the surrounding soil. The floor was tramped earth, sloped slightly toward one corner where she dug a small sump, a hole filled with gravel to catch any groundwater that might seep in. Timber framing came next. She salvaged lumber from an old shed that had collapsed the previous spring, cutting and fitting the beams to support the barn floor above. The beams ran perpendicular to the barn's existing joists, creating a ceiling for the underground room that could bear the weight of livestock, hay, and human traffic overhead. The entrance was the cleverest part. No exterior door, no obvious access point that would expose the chamber to wind or let cold air pour in. Instead, Eleanor cut a trapdoor through the barn floor itself, a 3-foot by 3-foot opening in the southwest corner of the barn, covered with planks that sat flush with the barn floor. From inside the barn, you could lift the trapdoor and descend a short ladder into the chamber below. The wind never knew it was there. Ventilation was critical. Without fresh air, the space would become suffocating. The small hearth she planned to install would smoke, and carbon monoxide would accumulate. Eleanor fashioned a ventilation pipe from clay drainage tiles, 8 inches in diameter, rising from the chamber's ceiling through the barn floor and out through the barn's north wall, where it disguised itself as a foundation vent. Simple, functional, invisible. For heat, she built a small corner hearth. Not a full fireplace. The chamber was too small for that. Just a firebox with a clay flue that vented up through the barn wall. The firebox was lined with fire brick she'd traded eggs and butter for at the general store. It only needed to hold a modest fire. The real heating system was the earth itself. 18 inches of packed soil surrounded the chamber on all sides. 18 inches of thermal mass that would slowly absorb heat from the small fire and radiate it back over hours. The Earth's natural temperature at that depth, somewhere between 45 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit, meant the chamber would never freeze, even without a fire. Above the chamber, separated only by timber beams and the barn's floorboards, 2 horses and a cow lived their routine lives. Their body heat, measurable, consistent, free, radiated downward. On a cold night, that animal heat could add 3 to 5 degrees to the chamber's temperature. And above the animals, stacked 8 feet high, sat the hay, a blanket of dried grass acting as insulation between the barn roof and the space below. Eleanor furnished the chamber simply, a rope bed frame with a straw-tick mattress, 2 smaller pallets for the children, a small table, a shelf for the oil lamp, and a water pitcher. Blankets, a trunk for clothes. Nothing more. It was strange. She knew that. A bedroom carved into the earth beneath a barn. A sleeping space where the ceiling was a floor, where livestock walked overhead, where the walls were stone and dirt. It didn't look like a home. It looked like something else, but it was warm, and warmth meant survival. By mid-November, the chamber was finished. Eleanor moved the children's bedding down first, testing the space, checking the ventilation, burning small fires in the hearth to make sure the flue drew properly. The air stayed clear. The temperature held steady. The children, young enough to think it was an adventure, asked if they were living in a cave now. For the winter, Eleanor told them. Just for the winter. People noticed, of course. In a territory where homesteads were spread miles apart, where survival often depended on neighborly cooperation, people paid attention to what others were doing. And what Eleanor Pritchard was doing seemed off. Nobody confronted her directly. That wasn't the way of it. But the talk started quietly, the way it always did. Samuel Corcoran, who ran the closest neighboring claim about 2 miles east, rode past one afternoon in late November and saw Eleanor emerging from the barn carrying blankets. He mentioned it that evening to his wife, who mentioned it to another woman at the church gathering the following Sunday. She's sleeping in a barn now, apparently. The barn. That's what Samuel said. Saw her coming out with bedding. The women exchanged looks. The kind of looks that said more than words. One of them, Margaret Yates, a schoolteacher who'd moved to Montana from Pennsylvania, spoke carefully. I suppose, Well, she's been alone since Henry passed. Maybe she's gone a bit peculiar with the grief. Peculiar. That word made the rounds. Eleanor Pritchard's gone peculiar. When Eleanor came to town for supplies in early December, she could feel the shift. Nothing overt. No one said anything cruel to her face. But there were glances, whispers that stopped when she approached. A certain distance in how people greeted her. At the general store, the clerk, a man named Douglas Kinney who'd sold her the firebrick, asked with exaggerated casualness, "Settling in for winter all right, Mrs. Pritchard?" "Well enough," Eleanor replied. "Heard you've been doing some building work." "Some." Douglas nodded slowly, weighing his words. "Ground gets awful cold this time of year. Clay soil holds water too. Fellow I knew tried to dig a root cellar too deep one winter, flooded out by March thaw. Lost everything he'd stored. It was a warning, dressed up as friendly advice." "I appreciate your concern," Eleanor said evenly, "but I've accounted for drainage." She paid for her flour and coffee and left without elaborating. The mockery was never loud. That was the strange part. In the stories people tell about innovation, there's usually a villain, some authority figure who publicly condemns the new idea, who tries to shut it down. But Eleanor didn't get that. What she got was softer, more insidious. She got pity. Poor woman, living like a prairie dog. That's no way for a Christian woman to raise children. Isaac Brennan, an older homesteader who'd been in the territory since before it was a territory, saw Eleanor splitting wood one afternoon and stopped his wagon to talk. He was a broad-shouldered man with a beard gone mostly gray, the kind of man people listened to because he'd survived things. "Mrs. Pritchard," he said, tipping his hat. "Wanted to check in. Make sure you're managing all right." "Managing fine, Mr. Brennan. Thank you." He nodded, then paused, choosing his words carefully. "Heard you've been spending nights in the barn space." "That true." Eleanor set down her axe. "I've made sleeping arrangements beneath the barn, yes." "Beneath." He repeated the word like he was testing it. "You mean underground?" "Yes, sir." Isaac rubbed his jaw. "Well, I suppose that's one approach. But I'll tell you straight, damp ground will take a person's lungs faster than the cold will. I've seen it. Seen men dig in too deep trying to get out of the wind, and the moisture gets them. Consumption. Fever. Bad way to go." "The chamber's dry," Eleanor said. "Stone walls. Good drainage." Maybe so. Maybe so. He didn't sound convinced. But winter's a hard test for that kind of setup. Ground freezes, it shifts. Water moves in ways you don't expect. "I'd hate to see you and those children in a bad spot come February." It was genuine concern. She could hear that. But beneath the concern was the assumption, the belief that she'd made a mistake, that she was in over her head, that her strange solution would fail when real winter arrived. "I appreciate the warning," Eleanor said. "I'll be careful." Isaac tipped his hat again and drove on. The children heard things too. Her son, Daniel, came home from a neighbor's farm one afternoon and asked, "Mama, are we poor?" Eleanor looked up from mending a shirt. "Why do you ask that?" "Billy Corcoran said we live underground because we can't afford a real house." Eleanor set down her sewing. "We live underground because it's warmer and uses less wood." "That's smart, not poor." Daniel didn't look convinced, but he nodded. The truth was, Eleanor didn't care much what people thought. She'd stopped caring about that when her husband died, and she realized survival didn't leave room for pride. But the constant undercurrent of judgment, the polite concern that was really criticism, the questions that were really doubts, it wore on her. By the time December ended and January cold arrived in earnest, Eleanor had stopped mentioning her living arrangements to anyone. She went to town when she needed supplies, spoke politely to neighbors when they crossed paths, and otherwise kept to herself. Let them think what they wanted. Winter would speak for itself. January 10th, 1887. The weather turned. It didn't start dramatic. No sudden storm. No black clouds rolling in like a wall. Just a slow drop in temperature. Morning frost that lingered past noon. Wind that picked up gradually, steadily, until by evening it was a constant howling presence. The next morning, the temperature was 12 degrees Fahrenheit. By noon, it was 6. By evening, it was below 0. And then the snow started. Not the light, dry snow that Montana got regularly in winter. This was different. Heavy, wet flakes driven by wind that had accelerated into something vicious. The kind of storm that old-timers recognized immediately and younger settlers only understood once they were in the middle of it. A blizzard. Within 6 hours, visibility dropped to near zero. The wind howled at sustained speeds above 40 miles per hour, with gusts hitting 60. Snow didn't fall so much as fly horizontally, piling into drifts that grew with terrifying speed. Drifts that buried fence posts. Drifts that climbed up the sides of buildings. Drifts that, by the second day, had buried some cabins to the roofline. The temperature kept dropping. 20 below, 30 below, 40 below zero. The kind of cold that turns breath to ice crystals before it leaves your mouth. The kind of cold that makes exposed skin go numb in under a minute. The kind of cold that kills livestock in their stalls and freezes water solid in covered buckets. Across the valley, families hunkered down. Samuel Corcoran's family huddled in their cabin with every blanket they owned piled on the children. Samuel fed the fireplace constantly, splitting wood, hauling it inside, burning it as fast as he could keep the fire going. The cabin stayed barely warm enough to prevent frostbite, maybe 35 degrees inside at best. The windows frosted over so thick you couldn't see through them. Ice formed on the interior walls where their breath condensed and froze. His wife wrapped hot stones from the fire in cloth and put them in the children's beds, but the stones only stayed warm for an hour before turning cold again. By the second day, they'd gone through a cord and a half of wood. Samuel looked at his remaining supply, maybe 2 more cords, meant to last until March, and did the math with growing dread. If the storm lasted another week, they'd run out. The Brennan family had it worse. Isaac had a larger cabin, more people to heat, his wife, for children ranging from 4 to 16, and his elderly father, who'd come west with them. Their fireplace was inefficient, built too wide and too shallow, more for cooking than heating. They burned through wood at an alarming rate and still couldn't get the cabin above freezing. On the second night, Isaac's father started coughing. Deep, wet coughs that shook the old man's frame. By morning, he was feverish, shaking under blankets next to the fire. Margaret Yates, the schoolteacher, lived alone in a small cabin attached to the schoolhouse. When the blizzard hit, she burned everything she could, firewood first, then kindling, then the small ladder she'd used to reach her loft, then 2 chairs. She wrapped herself in her coat and 3 blankets and sat as close to the fire as she could without catching her clothes alight. The cold was so penetrating, so absolute, that even next to the fire she shivered. On the third day, her chimney blocked with snow. She woke to find the cabin filled with smoke, the fire smoldering instead of burning clean. She had to choose, suffocate from smoke or freeze without the fire. She opened the door to clear the smoke, and the wind ripped it from her hand, slamming it against the wall. Snow poured in. She fought the door closed, gasping, coughing, and gave up on the fire entirely. For the next 12 hours, Margaret sat in a cabin that was functionally an icebox. When neighbors checked on her 4 days later, they found her alive, but hypothermic, barely conscious, wrapped in frozen blankets. They carried her to another cabin and spent 2 days warming her back to life. Across the territory, the story was the same. Families burning furniture, children developing frostbite indoors, livestock dying in barns despite attempts to keep them warm, men frostbitten just from the 20-foot walk between house and barn to feed animals. The cold was a physical enemy, something you could fight but never fully defeat. You could only survive it, hour by hour, log by log, hoping your supply lasted longer than the storm. But in Eleanor Pritchard's barn, something different was happening. Or rather, almost nothing was happening. No frantic wood splitting. No constant fire feeding. No desperate attempts to block every draft. From outside, the barn looked quiet. No smoke from the clay vent pipe. No signs of struggle. Samuel Corcoran noticed on the third day. He'd been checking on his own livestock when the wind died briefly, and in that moment of relative calm, he looked across the valley toward Eleanor's place. No smoke. He stared, squinting against the bright snow glare. The Pritchard barn was there, half buried in drifts but intact. The cabin next to it stood dark and cold-looking. But the barn, nothing. No smoke. No activity. Samuel felt a cold knot of dread form in his stomach. She's dead. They're all dead. He told his wife that night, voice heavy. I'll check on them when this breaks. But I think we're going to find bodies. Stay with me, because what happened next changed everything they thought about shelter. Samuel Corcoran waited until the fourth day. The wind had finally dropped to something manageable. Still bitter, still dangerous, but no longer the howling wall of force that made travel impossible. The temperature had climbed slightly, maybe -20 instead of -40. Progress in its way. He bundled himself in every layer he owned, wrapped a scarf around his face until only his eyes showed, and set out on snowshoes toward the Pritchard property. The snow was waist-deep in places, deeper where it had drifted. The 2-mile journey took him nearly an hour. He expected the worst. A widow and 2 children in a barn, underground, in the coldest weather Montana had seen in living memory. No smoke from the property in 3 days. Samuel had seen enough frontier deaths to know what that likely meant. Hypothermia. Carbon monoxide if they tried to heat the space improperly. Suffocation if the ventilation had failed. He approached the barn slowly, dreading what he'd find. The barn door was drifted shut, but not buried. Samuel cleared enough snow to pull it open and stepped inside. The interior was dark, cold, but noticeably warmer than outside. The 2 horses and the cow stood in their stalls, calm, well-fed. They had been pulled down from the loft recently. He could see fresh pieces scattered on the floor. Someone had been caring for the animals. Then he heard it, a child's voice, muffled but clear, coming from beneath his feet. "Mama, is that someone upstairs?" Samuel nearly fell over in shock. He looked down and saw it, the trapdoor barely visible in the dim light. A voice came up through it, adult, female, cautious. "Who's there? Mrs. Pritchard?" Samuel's voice cracked slightly. "It's Samuel Corcoran. I came to check on you." There was a pause. Then the sound of a ladder being positioned, and Eleanor's face appeared in the opening, rising up through the floor. She looked fine. Not frostbitten, not hypothermic, not desperate. She looked like a woman who'd just woken from a decent night's sleep. "Mr. Corcoran," she said, climbing up into the barn. "That's kind of you. We're managing well." Samuel stared at her. "Managing well?" "Yes, sir. But there's been no smoke." "I thought." Eleanor nodded toward the clay vent pipe that emerged from the barn wall. "Ventilation's working fine. I've only needed small fires, and the smoke dissipates quickly. Didn't want to waste wood keeping a fire burning for no reason." Samuel tried to process this. "You've been comfortable? The children are sleeping now. Would you like to see?" She gestured to the trapdoor, and after a moment's hesitation, Samuel descended. The temperature change was immediate and startling. The barn above had been cold, maybe 20 degrees. The chamber below was warm. Not blazing hot, not uncomfortably stuffy, but genuinely, noticeably warm. Warm enough that Samuel could feel his face start to thaw. Warm enough that his fingers, numb from the walk, began to tingle back to life. He pulled down his scarf and looked around. The space was small, stone-walled, lit by a single oil lamp. The 2 children slept on pallets against one wall, covered by blankets, but not the desperate pile of every blanket a family owned. Just sleeping. Normal sleeping. Eleanor's breath wasn't visible in the air. Samuel's had been visible in his own cabin with the fire roaring. There was a small hearth in the corner, but no fire burned in it currently. Just cold ashes from what looked like a modest fire hours ago. "What's the temperature in here?" Samuel asked. Eleanor had a thermometer hanging on the wall, a mercury tube model her husband had brought from back east. She checked it. 54 degrees right now. It was 57 last night before bed. Samuel's mind struggled with the math. 54 degrees, with no active fire, when outside was 40 below zero. "How," he said simply. Eleanor explained, walking him through the design. The stone walls absorbing heat slowly and releasing it over hours. The earth surrounding them, holding a stable temperature. The livestock overhead, their body heat radiating down through the floorboards. The hay above the barn, acting as insulation. The small, efficient fire she burned in the evening, just enough to add warmth to the mass, which then held it through the night. I burned maybe 1/8 of a core in the last 4 days, she said. Just evening fires for a few hours. The rest of the time, the earth holds the warmth. Samuel did rough mental calculation. His family had burned nearly 2 full cords in the same period and had barely stayed above freezing. 8 times less wood, 20 degrees warmer. And you sleep through the night? He asked. Don't wake to feed the fire? Haven't needed to. The temperature doesn't drop fast enough to matter. By morning, it's usually still above 50. Samuel sat down on the edge of Eleanor's rope bed, trying to absorb this. Above freezing all night without tending the fire. In his cabin, if the fire died for more than 2 hours, they'd wake to ice forming inside. The children, he said, they're not sick? Not too cold. Eleanor smiled slightly. Daniel had a cold 2 weeks ago. Regular winter cold, nothing serious. Cleared up in a few days. Sarah's been healthy all season. Better than last winter by far. Better than last winter. Last winter, in the cabin, her daughter had nearly died of pneumonia. Samuel climbed back up to the barn, Eleanor following. He stood there in the cold barn space, looking at the trapdoor, the vent pipe, the hay overhead, trying to match what he'd seen with what he'd expected. He'd expected death. He'd found warmth. Mrs. Pritchard, he said slowly, this is remarkable. Eleanor shrugged. It's practical. That's all. No, Samuel said, shaking his head. This is more than practical. This is, he paused, searching for the right word. This is smart. This is engineering. Eleanor didn't respond, but Samuel saw something in her expression. Not pride exactly. Relief, maybe. The relief of being understood instead of mocked. People need to know about this, Samuel said. People thought I was crazy, Eleanor pointed out. People were wrong. Samuel left 20 minutes later, trudging back through the snow to his own frigid cabin. His mind was racing. The temperature difference, the wood savings, the stability, the fact that Eleanor Pritchard and her children were sleeping comfortably while everyone else was fighting to survive. He told his wife that evening, describing everything he'd seen. She listened, first with disbelief, then with growing interest. 54 degrees, she repeated. With no fire? With no fire burning at the time I was there, yes. And the children? Sleeping like it was spring. His wife was quiet for a moment, then said, We mocked her. We all mocked her. We did, Samuel agreed. The next morning, despite the ongoing cold, Samuel walked to the Brennan place and told Isaac what he'd found. Isaac listened, skeptical at first, then thoughtful. You're saying she's warmer underground than we are in proper cabins? 20 degrees warmer, using a fraction of the wood. Isaac rubbed his jaw. The same gesture he'd made when warning Eleanor about the dangers of underground moisture months earlier. Well, he said slowly, I suppose I was wrong about that. By the time the blizzard fully broke a week later and travel became possible again, the story had spread. Samuel told neighbors. Isaac told others. People who'd been suffering through the cold, burning through their wood supplies at terrifying rates, suddenly heard about Eleanor Pritchard sleeping warm underground on almost no fuel. The reaction wasn't immediate acceptance. Some people remained skeptical. But desperation is a powerful motivator, and another winter would come eventually. People started asking questions. The visits began in late February. First, it was Margaret Yates, the schoolteacher who'd nearly frozen in her smoke-filled cabin. She arrived at Eleanor's homestead on a clear, cold afternoon with a notebook and pencil. Mrs. Pritchard, she said directly, I'd like to see your underground room, if you'd permit me, and I'd like to take measurements. Eleanor showed her. Margaret descended into the chamber, pulled out her measuring tape, and spent an hour recording dimensions. Width, depth, ceiling height, wall thickness, hearth size, ventilation pipe diameter. She sketched a rough diagram, asked questions about drainage, about stone placement, about how Eleanor managed moisture. I'm building a new cabin this spring, Margaret explained, and I'm not spending another winter like the last one. If I can incorporate even part of this design. She wasn't the only one. Isaac Brennan came next, bringing his eldest son. They examined the stone walls, the timber framing, the trapdoor entrance. Isaac was particularly interested in the ventilation system, how air moved through the space, how the fire drew properly despite being underground. "How about a root cellar?" he said thoughtfully. "Dug 5 years back. Never thought about making it livable. But if I extended it, added proper walls, cut a vent..." He looked at Eleanor. "Would you mind if I copied this?" "Copy whatever you like," Eleanor said. "It's not a secret." And that was the pattern. No formal publicity. No newspaper article. No announcement at church. Just quiet, practical sharing. One neighbor telling another. Families visiting, measuring, asking questions. By the following autumn, the autumn of 1887, 4 families within 20 miles had modified their root cellars into winter sleeping rooms. They weren't exact copies of Eleanor's design. Some used different stone. Some incorporated the space under an existing cabin instead of a barn. Some made the rooms larger or smaller, depending on family size. But the principle was the same. Go underground, use thermal mass, minimize heat loss, let the earth do the work. The Johnson family, who lived 8 miles south, built what they called a winter parlor, a semi-underground space attached to their cabin where the whole family could gather in the evening. They reported using 40% less wood that winter compared to previous years. The Kowalski family, recent Polish immigrants who'd suffered badly during the '87 blizzard, dug a full underground room beneath their barn before the following winter. They added a clever innovation, a sand bed beneath their sleeping platforms that they could heat with coals wrapped in sheet metal, creating a slow-release heat source that lasted through the night. Douglas Kinney, the general store clerk who'd warned Eleanor about flooding, started stocking more firebrick and clay pipe. He mentioned to customers that there was increasing interest in underground construction and that he could order specific materials if needed. By 1889, the local newspaper, a small weekly called the Fergus County Advocate, ran a brief article titled "Modern Pioneer Shelters. Underground Rooms Gain Favor." The article mentioned Eleanor by name, describing her as a widow who innovated a practical heating solution during the harsh winter of 1887. The article was 3 paragraphs long and buried on page 4, but it marked a shift. What had been seen as strange was now seen as smart. What had been mocked was now admired. Eleanor herself remained modest about the whole thing. She didn't seek recognition, didn't claim to have invented anything revolutionary. When neighbors asked her about the design, she'd shrug and say, "I just used what was available." But the legacy spread beyond personal recognition. By 1892, homesteading guides published in Montana began including brief sections on earth-sheltered sleeping quarters as an option for families building in cold regions. The descriptions were basic: dig below frost line, ensure drainage, ventilate properly, but the concept had entered the formal literature. Architectural pattern books from the era started showing Montana-style basement sleeping rooms as an alternative to traditional cabin layouts. Some builders began incorporating partial underground spaces into new construction as a standard feature. The technique evolved. People experimented. Some failures happened: poorly drained rooms that did flood, inadequate ventilation that caused smoke problems, structural issues when spaces were dug too large without proper support. But the successes outnumbered the failures, and each iteration refined the approach. By the early 1900s, as Montana Territory became Montana State and the frontier era faded, underground or partially underground sleeping spaces had become an accepted part of regional building tradition. Not universal. Plenty of people stuck with traditional above-ground cabins, but common enough that it wasn't considered strange. Eleanor lived on her homestead until 1903, when she sold the property and moved to Lewistown to be closer to her daughter, who'd married and started a family. The new owners of the property, a young couple from Iowa, specifically wanted the place because of the famous underground room. They kept using it every winter for the next 20 years. Daniel, Eleanor's son, eventually built his own homestead 30 miles west. He incorporated a partial underground room in his design, though he modified it, making it larger, adding windows set into light wells, using concrete instead of stone for the walls. He told people it was his mother's design, modernized. Sarah, the daughter who nearly died of pneumonia in the cabin, grew up healthy. She became a schoolteacher like Margaret Yates, and in her classroom, she kept a diagram of the underground room on the wall. When students asked about it, she'd tell them the story, how her mother had been mocked for digging, how the blizzard had proved the design, how warmth and survival sometimes required thinking differently. The phrase that people remembered, the phrase that eventually got associated with Eleanor's story, wasn't anything Eleanor herself had said. It came from Samuel Corcoran years later when someone asked him about the underground room innovation. She wasn't being strange, Samuel had said. She was being practical. And sometimes practical looks strange until the crisis proves you right. That was the lesson that stuck. Not that underground rooms were a miracle solution. Not that everyone should abandon traditional building. But that survival engineering often comes from quiet observation, from necessity, from someone willing to try something different when the conventional approach isn't working. Eleanor Pritchard didn't invent underground housing. Humans have been using earth-sheltered structures for thousands of years, from ancient pit houses to sod homes to modern earth-bermed buildings. What she did was adapt that ancient wisdom to her specific situation, using materials at hand, solving a problem that was killing people. And in doing that, she reminded a whole region of frontier settlers that sometimes the old ways, the ways that seemed primitive or backward, were actually the ways that worked best. The Earth is a battery. It stores heat. It moderates temperature. It protects against wind. All you have to do is use it. That was Eleanor's contribution. Not a grand invention, but a practical demonstration. A proof that when you stop worrying about what looks proper and start focusing on what works, you can survive conditions that would otherwise kill you. The underground room beneath that Montana barn wasn't just a shelter. It was a lesson. And like all good lessons, it spread quietly, person to person, winter by winter, until it became part of how people thought about survival. Today, earth-sheltered housing is a recognized field in sustainable architecture. Modern engineers use sophisticated software to model thermal mass performance, calculate R values, and optimize underground construction. But the fundamental principle, the one Eleanor Pritchard demonstrated in 1886, hasn't changed. Go underground. Use the Earth's stable temperature. Minimize heat loss. Let natural systems do the work. In an era of rising energy costs and growing interest in off-grid living, Eleanor's century-old design remains relevant, not as a historical curiosity, but as a practical template. The materials change. Modern builders use concrete, foam insulation, mechanical ventilation, but the physics stays the same. Warmth isn't about fighting the cold with constant energy. It's about storing what you have, protecting what you've stored, and letting natural systems sustain it. Eleanor understood that. She understood it because she had to, because survival demanded it. Because when your children are cold and your wood is running out and the frontier doesn't care about your pride, you find solutions that work. That's frontier engineering. Not grand, not glamorous, but brutally effective when it needs to be. And sometimes, that's exactly what saved your life. Where are you watching from? And what's the coldest winter you've ever faced? Drop a comment below. I read every one, and your stories matter. If this kind of practical frontier wisdom speaks to you, hit subscribe. Every week, I bring you one more technique that worked when lives depended on it. Real history, real engineering, real survival. Thanks for watching. Stay warm out there. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.